The rain fell in a cold, relentless sheet, turning the Kentucky Trail into a river of mud. It was October of 1878, and for Thomas Finch, a lone merchant pushing his weary horse toward the promise of civilization, the storm was a death sentence. For hours he had seen nothing but the gnarled, skeletal fingers of trees clawing at a bruised sky. Then through the deluge, a single point of light, a lantern hanging from a porch. It was an inn, a place so isolated it felt less like a discovery and more like a trap laid by the wilderness itself. The sign, creaking on rusted hinges, read "The Shepherd's Rest." Gratitude overwhelmed his caution. Inside, the warmth was immediate, a roaring hearth pushing back the damp chill. A woman, gaunt but with a strange, fixed smile, introduced herself as Elara Shepherd. Her husband, Silas, was a mountain of a man who simply nodded, his eyes like chips of flint. They offered him the last of their evening meal, a hot, savory meat pie. The aroma was intoxicating, rich with herbs and spices. Thomas ate gratefully, the flaky crust and dense, flavor fulfilling a balm to his exhausted body. But as he ate, a peculiar detail surfaced in his mind. The meat was tender, almost sweet, with a texture unlike any beef or mutton he'd ever tasted. He dismissed it as a regional recipe, a secret of the house. His gaze drifted around the room, landing on the shepherd's eldest son, a lanky youth named Jebediah who was sitting by the fire, methodically sharpening a long, curved cleaver. It wasn't the tool that was unsettling, but its shape. It was not a butcher's cleaver, nor was it a woodman's axe. It seemed purpose-built for something else entirely. The air, once so welcoming, suddenly grew heavy, thick with an unspoken, macabre tension. Thomas put down his fork, the pie in his stomach turning to a cold, heavy stone. To understand the darkness that pooled in places like the Shepherd's Rest, one must first understand the landscape of 1878 Kentucky. The Civil War was a raw, festering wound, and the period of Reconstruction had left much of the rural South in a state of impoverished lawlessness. This was especially true in the untamed foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, a labyrinth of deep hollows and dense, primordial forests where official authority was a distant rumor. For travelers, these winding trails were a necessary evil. They were arteries of commerce and migration, but they pulsed with danger. Outlaws, desperate settlers, and the unforgiving wilderness itself claimed lives with horrifying regularity. Newspapers of the era were filled with brief, grim notices of men and women who had simply vanished. A peddler last seen near Cumberland Gap. A young couple heading for the promise of the West, their wagon found abandoned weeks later. A geologist prospecting for coal, his tools discovered rusting in a creek bed, but his body never recovered. These stories became a kind of background noise, the accepted cost of progress. In this brutal world, hospitality was a sacred currency. A warm bed, a hot meal, these were acts of profound grace. Inns and taverns were beacons of safety. Yet, whispers persisted among the locals, stories told in hushed tones over cheap whiskey. They were tales of places you shouldn't stop, of families you shouldn't trust. They spoke of a particular inn, nestled deep in a valley perpetually choked with fog, a place known to some as Whispering Hollow. They said the family who ran it, the Shepherds, had a knack for making travelers feel welcome. So welcome, in fact, that many who checked in were never seen again. It was a forbidden story, a local legend you didn't repeat to outsiders, for fear of what that kind of attention might bring. The Shepherd family was an enigma, woven into the fabric of the hollow like the creeping ivy that choked the trees. They were four souls who moved as one, a silent, predatory unit. The patriarch Silas was a man carved from the mountain itself. He rarely spoke, communicating instead with glares and grunts, his massive hands capable of splitting logs or, it was rumored, something far less resilient. His presence was a weight, pressing down on the very air of the inn. His wife, Elara, was his opposite in form but not in spirit. She was thin and wiry, her skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones. She was the face of their hospitality, offering warm broth and softer words, but her smile was a mask that never quite concealed the cold, calculating emptiness in her eyes. It was a smile that watched, that measured. Then there were the sons, Jebediah and Caleb. They were young men in their late teens or early 20s, possessing a disquieting stillness. They moved through the dense woods surrounding the inn with a supernatural silence, more like ghosts than men. They were the inn's hunters, their father would claim, responsible for keeping the larder full. The family's only claim to any sort of renown was their meat pies. Travelers who had passed Thr. Safely would sometimes speak of them, remarking on their unique, rich flavor. Ilara would coyly attribute it to a generations-old family recipe, a secret blend of herbs and spices brought over from the old country. It was this single, mundane detail, a well-made pie, that served as the family's shield. It normalized them, painting a picture of simple, rustic folk making an honest living. But it was a carefully constructed facade, a culinary lie that concealed a horrifying, macabre truth. The secret ingredient in the shepherd's pies was not a spice. It was something far more disturbing. The geography of Whispering Hollow was a co-conspirator in the shepherd's dark enterprise. It was not a place one arrived at by choice, but by desperation. The main thoroughfare, a rough and rutted track that passed for a road, bypassed the valley entirely, clinging to higher, safer ground. The path to the Shepherd's Rest was a treacherous offshoot, a poorly marked trail that snaked down into the deep, bowl-shaped depression. It was a route travelers only took if they were hopelessly lost, caught in a sudden storm, or foolishly attempting a shortcut that local wisdom strictly forbade. The hollow itself seemed to exist in its own climate. A perpetual mist clung to the forest floor, muffling sound and distorting distances. Towering, ancient oaks and pines formed a dense canopy that plunged the valley into a premature twilight, even at midday. The air was heavy, damp, and unnervingly still. Local folklore, passed down from the first settlers, spoke of the land itself. They said the hollow was cursed, a place where the earth was hungry. They told tales of livestock wandering into the mist and never returning, of hunters who lost their way for weeks, emerging with haunted eyes and refusing to speak of what they'd seen. This oppressive, almost sentient landscape provided the perfect hunting ground. It isolated the shepherd's inn from the outside world, creating a pocket dimension where the normal rules of society did not apply. It delivered a steady stream of vulnerable, disoriented victims right to their doorstep. The forest hid their secrets, the fog muffled any potential screams, and the cursed earth seemed all too willing to swallow the evidence of their forbidden acts. The Shepherd's Rest was not merely on the land. It felt like an extension of it, the predatory heart of a hungry wilderness. For years, the disappearances were just disconnected whispers, tragic but unrelated footnotes in the brutal history of the frontier. But in the spring of 1877, one case began to pull at the threads of this grim tapestry. Elias Reed was a peddler, a man well known and well liked in the scattered townships of eastern Kentucky. He was a creature of habit, his roots as predictable as the changing seasons. He was cheerful, talkative, and his arrival was an event, bringing news, goods, and a welcome break from the crushing isolation of rural life. In April, he was making his way south, his cart laden with fabrics, tools, and trinkets. His last confirmed sighting was by a farmer who shared a bit of hardtack with him at a crossroads. Elias had mentioned he was considering taking the Old Valley Pass to save a day's travel, a route that would lead him directly through Whispering Hollow. He was never seen again. At first, his absence was noted with casual concern. Elias was a savvy traveler, perhaps he'd been delayed or had changed his route. But weeks turned into a month and then two. The concern soured into dread. A search party was formed, but the vast, unforgiving wilderness offered up no clues. It was as if Elias Reed and his entire cart had been swallowed by the earth. Finally, in late summer, a hunter found Elias' horse wandering miles away from the valley, thin and skittish, its harness broken. Of the peddler and his goods there was no sign. The official conclusion was predictable: another victim of bandits, or perhaps a fatal accident in the treacherous terrain. But for those who knew the old stories, who knew of the hungry hollow and the strange family that resided within it, a colder, more disturbing possibility began to take root. Elias Reed's disappearance was different. He was known. He would be missed. And his vanishing was the first loose stone that would eventually trigger an avalanche. Elias Reed's vanishing was not an isolated incident. It was merely the most prominent. Once people began to look closer, a horrifying pattern emerged from the fog of the past. There was the young couple, the Millers, who had sold their farm back east and were heading to Missouri with their life savings sewn into the lining of their coats. Their last letter home spoke of the beautiful but foreboding Kentucky hills and their intention to press on quickly. They were traced to a town just a day's ride from Whispering Hollow, and then nothing. They vanished. A year prior, a geologist from Boston named Alastair Finch had been commissioned to survey the region for coal deposits. A meticulous man, his detailed notes and journals were legendary. His last entry described his discovery of a strange, isolated valley that didn't appear on his maps and his intention to explore it. His camp was found, his scientific instruments neatly packed, his journal lying open on his cot. But Alastair Finch was gone. The list went on. A lone preacher carrying Bibles to remote communities. Two brothers returning from a cattle drive with a pouch full of silver dollars. Each story was a ghost, a life abruptly cut short on the lonely trails surrounding that one particular hollow. The common threads were chillingly consistent. The victims were travelers, strangers to the area. Most were carrying something of value, be it money, goods, or simply the flesh on their bones. And their last known trajectory always pointed toward the same dark crease in the Kentucky landscape. The local constabulary, a single, overworked sheriff in a town 30 miles away, recorded each case with a weary sigh. To him, these were just more sad tales of the frontier. He lacked the manpower, the resources, and frankly, the imagination to connect these disparate events into a single, macabre conspiracy. The shepherds in their hollow remained undisturbed, a spider at the center of a vast and growing web. The complacency of the law might have held indefinitely, were it not for the arrival of Deputy Aaron Miller. Miller was a young man, recently transferred from a more populated county, and he possessed a quality that was rare in this worn-down corner of the world: ambition. He was sharp, observant, and he saw the stack of missing person reports not as a collection of unfortunate, isolated tragedies, but as a single, sprawling cold case. He spent his evenings poring over the files, spreading maps across his small desk and drawing lines. He marked the last known locations of the vanished, and his pen kept returning, again and again, to the same unnamed valley. He saw the pattern that everyone else had dismissed. Miller was an outsider, unburdened by the local superstitions and the unspoken agreements to leave certain things alone. When he brought his theory to Sheriff Brody, the older man just shook his head. "That's shepherd land, son," Brody warned, his voice low. "Them hollow folk, they're a different breed. Best to let sleeping dogs lie." This warning, meant to deter him, only solidified Miller's resolve. He was a man of the law, and the law, he believed, should not be afraid of hollow folk or sleeping dogs. He began his investigation quietly, talking to farmers on the outskirts of the valley, to hunters and trappers who knew the woods. He gathered whispers, fragments of stories about the silent family at the inn, their strange reclusiveness, and the unsettling feeling many got when passing the turnoff to their property. Deputy Miller was stepping into a darkness far deeper than he could possibly imagine, a lonely crusade against an evil that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long. He was one man against a family of monsters, and he was heading directly for their den. As Deputy Miller dug deeper, he unearthed a rich vein of dark folklore surrounding the Shepherd clan. In the smoky backrooms of taverns and around the dim fires of hunting camps, the family was spoken of not as innkeepers, but as something older, something more primal. The stories were fragmented, often contradictory, but they all painted a picture of a family deeply at odds with the world around them. One of the most persistent rumors concerned the smoke from their chimney. Several hunters who had camped on the ridges overlooking the hollow swore they had seen it puffing away at odd hours, long after any respectable traveler would have been fed and put to bed. And the smell, they said, was wrong. It wasn't the clean, savory scent of wood smoke and roasting game. It was a heavy, cloying, sickly sweet odor that clung to the damp air, a smell that turned the stomach. Whispers of a family curse were also common. The older folks recalled that the shepherds weren't native to that hollow. They had arrived a generation before, sometime in the 1840s, having been driven out of a community deeper in the Appalachian Mountains. The reasons were always vague, unspoken blasphemies, an unnatural disregard for the sanctity of the dead. Some tales even hinted at forbidden appetites, an ancient hunger that had followed their bloodline across the ocean from a famine-ravaged old world. These stories were, of course, dismissed by most as the superstitious ramblings of uneducated country folk. But for Deputy Miller, they were data points. They created a psychological profile of a family steeped in isolation and secrecy, a family that the local population instinctively feared and avoided. The folklore was a warning, a collective, subconscious recognition that the evil in Whispering Hollow was not a new phenomenon. It was ancient. Words and rumors were not enough. Deputy Miller knew he needed to see the place for himself, to look the shepherds in the eye. He traded his uniform for the dusty clothes of a weary traveler, mounted his horse, and rode toward the hollow. As he descended the winding path, the world grew quiet and dim, the air cooling as the mist swallowed him. The shepherd's rest appeared exactly as described, a squat, dark building that seemed to crouch against the hillside, watching him approach. He was greeted by Elara Shepherd. Her smile was a perfect, unsettling curve, and her eyes scanned him from head to toe, a silent, predatory assessment. Silas stood behind her, a hulking shadow in the doorway. Miller spun a tale of being a land surveyor, lost and in need of a hot meal and a place to rest his head. He was invited in. The interior was oppressively clean, the air thick with the scent of pine soap and something else, the rich, savory aroma of a simmering stew. He was offered a bowl, which he accepted. It was delicious. The meat was impossibly tender, falling apart on his tongue in a way that beef, even when slow-cooked for hours, rarely did. "Our own recipe," Elara said, her eyes gleaming. "The secret is in the seasoning and the stock." Miller ate slowly, his senses on high alert. He listened to the profound silence of the house, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic creak of a floorboard upstairs. He felt the weight of their collective gaze upon him, the intense, unwavering scrutiny of a family sizing up a potential resource. He was not a guest in their home. He was an item of inventory. The stew in his stomach felt like poison, and he knew with cold certainty that he was in the presence of an unimaginable evil. Deputy Miller forced himself to finish the stew, making appreciative comments to Elara about her cooking, all the while his mind was racing, cataloging every detail of the room. The worn furniture, the clean-swept floor, the neatly stacked firewood. It was all so normal, deceptively so. His eyes scanned the large stone mantelpiece above the hearth, which was adorned with a bizarre collection of objects, a few polished river stones, a bird's nest, and a handful of cheap tin-type portraits of grim-faced ancestors. But among them, one item glinted in the firelight, catching his eye. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age but intricately carved with the image of a songbird. Miller's blood ran cold. He felt a jolt, a sickening surge of adrenaline that he had to fight to conceal. He had seen that locket before, not in person, but in a detailed, hand-drawn sketch included in a missing persons report. It had belonged to Sarah Miller, the young wife who had vanished with her husband on their way to Missouri the previous year. The report, filed by her grieving father, had described the locket in painstaking detail, noting that it was a one-of-a-kind family heirloom. And there it was, sitting on the mantelpiece of this remote inn as a casual decoration. It was the first piece of concrete, tangible proof. It was no longer a matter of rumor or suspicion. The monster of Whispering Hollow was real, and he was sitting in its living room. He had to get out, and he had to do it without betraying the horrifying knowledge that was now screaming in his mind. The air in the room was suddenly unbreathable, the fixed smiles of the shepherds no longer just unsettling, but the grins of waiting executioners. Leaving the shepherd's rest was one of the most difficult things Deputy Miller had ever done. He had to feign weariness, make polite conversation, and pay for his meal while every instinct screamed at him to draw his revolver and run. He managed a plausible excuse about needing to make it to the next town before nightfall, thanked the shepherds for their hospitality, and walked out into the misty afternoon, the weight of their eyes on his back until the trail curved out of sight. The ride back to town was a blur of frantic energy. The silver locket on the mantelpiece burned in his memory, a definitive link between the vanished and this silent predatory family. He burst into Sheriff Brody's office, the words tumbling out of him. The inn, the unsettling atmosphere, the meat, and finally the locket. He expected shock, perhaps even an apology for the earlier dismissal. Instead, he was met with a deep, weary sigh. The sheriff listened, his old face etched with a profound reluctance. "A locket, son," Brody said, rubbing his temples. "It's a common design. You can't accuse a family of what you're suggesting based on a trinket. You have no bodies, no witnesses. The shepherds have been in that hollow for 40 years. Storming their home with a half-baked theory will get us all killed and make this county a laughingstock." Miller was stunned into silence. He was facing a wall of institutional inertia and fear. The sheriff wasn't just skeptical, he was actively afraid of confronting the shepherds. It was an unspoken CT, the shepherds kept to their hollow, and the law kept to the town. Miller realized with a sinking heart that he was utterly alone in this. The official channels were closed to him. The system designed to uphold justice was refusing to act, paralyzed by a deep-seated fear of the very darkness it was supposed to fight. The kind of evil that festered in forgotten corners of the world, far from the light of civilization, is a recurring theme in these forbidden histories. It's a darkness that grows in silence and isolation, nourished by fear and apathy. Deputy Miller had come face to face with it, but he had also come face to face with a more mundane and perhaps more insidious obstacle: the unwillingness of good men to act. Sheriff Brody's refusal was not born of malice, but of a weary pragmatism that had been ground into him by years of policing a violent and unforgiving frontier. To him, the shepherds were a problem without a solution, a cancer best left undisturbed. This chilling reality, that monsters can thrive not just because of their own cunning, but because of the inaction of those around them, is a truly disturbing thought. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the past and the shadows it still casts. If you find yourself compelled to uncover more stories like this, narratives that have been deliberately buried or conveniently forgotten, consider subscribing to this channel. Because Deputy Miller's lonely crusade was far from over. He was a man abandoned by the very system he represented, and his next move would take him far outside the bounds of the law, deep into the heart of a truly American nightmare. He knew he couldn't force the sheriff's hand, so he would have to find another way. He would have to unearth the history of the shepherds himself, to find a truth so undeniable that even a frightened old sheriff couldn't ignore it. Frustrated by the law's inaction, Deputy Miller turned his attention from evidence to history. He began a meticulous, time-consuming search through the county's archives, dusty, leather-bound books filled with deeds, census records, and court filings. He was looking for the origin of the Shepherd clan. As the old-timers had whispered, he found that they were not long-time residents of Whispering Hollow. Their land deed was dated 1842. The patriarch at the time was named Thaddeus Shepherd, Silas's father. Before that date, there was no record of them in the county. Miller expanded his search, sending letters to courthouses in neighboring states, focusing on the mountainous regions of Virginia and North Carolina, the likely origin point for settlers in this part of Kentucky. Weeks later, a reply arrived from a small, remote county on the other side of the mountains. The clerk was an old man with a long memory. He remembered the name Shepherd. They had not been landowners, he wrote, but tenants on a large, isolated tract of land owned by a church. They had been driven out, the clerk explained, though the official records were sealed. But he remembered the stories his father had told him. The shepherds had been excommunicated, cast out after a series of horrifying accusations. There had been a terrible winter, a famine that had swept through the mountains. Several members of the isolated community had disappeared. The shepherds, however, had remained suspiciously well-fed. The accusations were never proven, but they were dark and visceral, centering on blasphemous rituals and the desecration of the dead. They were accused of practicing a forbidden, ancestral form of survival, an unnatural appetite that horrified their God-fearing neighbors. The letter confirmed the folklore. The shepherd's darkness was not new, it was an inheritance. Just as Miller was beginning to despair, a new piece of the puzzle fell into his lap, albeit a ragged and unreliable one. A local trapper named Silas Croft, a man known more for his love of corn liquor than his credibility, was arrested for brawling in a saloon. In his drunken tirade, he started screaming about the shepherd boys, Jebediah and Caleb. Miller, overhearing the commotion, pulled the man into his office to sober up and listen to his story. Croft claimed he had been checking his trap lines a few nights before, deep in the woods bordering the shepherd property. He had gotten turned around as night fell and blundered closer to their land than he ever intended. He described being hunted, not by an animal but by the two shepherd brothers. He said they moved through the undergrowth with no lanterns, silent as panthers, their movements coordinated and predatory. He hid in a thicket, his heart hammering against his ribs as they passed just yards from him, and they weren't empty-handed. They were dragging something heavy between them, a large canvas sack that was leaking a dark fluid onto the forest floor. Croft swore it was the body of a man. He said he stayed hidden for an hour, half mad with terror, before scrambling back to town. The story was wild, the ravings of a notorious drunk. Sheriff Brody dismissed it out of hand, but Miller listened intently. Croft, for all his flaws, was one of the most experienced woodsmen in the county. He knew the difference between a deer and a man, even wrapped in canvas, and he described a detail that made Miller's blood freeze. He said that as the brothers dragged their grim cargo back toward the inn, they weren't whispering or talking. They were humming. A strange, tuneless, and utterly chilling melody, a sound of cheerful, monotonous work. Deputy Miller pressed the frightened trapper for more details. Silas Croft, now sober and trembling, provided a piece of information that transformed his wild story into a terrifyingly plausible account. He described the path the shepherd brothers had taken. They hadn't gone toward the inn's front door or even the barn. Instead, they had circled around to a small, windowless outbuilding set back among the trees, partially hidden from view. A smokehouse. Croft was insistent on this point. He had built and used smokehouses his entire life, and he knew one when he saw one. But this one, he said, was different. It was larger than any he'd ever seen, bigger than what would be needed for curing venison or pork for a family of 4. And the chimney was made of stone, built with a permanence that suggested heavy, constant use. But it was what he saw near the smokehouse that truly haunted him. In the dim moonlight, he had glimpsed a pile of discarded bones near the building's rear wall. As a trapper, Croft had seen thousands of animal skeletons. He knew the curve of a deer's rib, the shape of a bear's skull. The bones in that pile, he swore, were different. They were longer, more slender. And at the top of the heap he had seen something that made him turn and run without looking back. A human skull, its empty sockets staring up at the moon. The dread was no longer a slow-creeping suspicion for Miller. It was a physical weight, a certainty that settled in his gut. The pies, the locket, the family's dark history, and now a hidden smokehouse with a pile of human bones. The picture was complete, and it was more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The sheriff's refusal to act, combined with the trapper's horrifying testimony, pushed Deputy Miller to a decision. If the law would not go to Whispering Hollow, he would have to bring a different kind of justice himself. He could not do it alone. The shepherds were 4 strong, and as Croft's story suggested, they were more than capable of extreme violence. Miller began to quietly sound out some of the men in town, choosing them carefully. He sought out those who were not just brave, but who had a personal stake in the disappearances. He found his first recruit in the town blacksmith, a powerful man named Isaac Thorne, whose cousin, a traveling preacher, had vanished on the southern road 2 years prior. Next came 2 brothers, farmers named MacLeod, whose father had disappeared after a trip to sell his crops. These were hard, practical men, not given to flights of fancy. When Miller laid out what he knew, the locket, the family's history, the trapper's account of the smokehouse, They listened with grim, stony faces. They had all heard the whispers about the hollow, and Miller's evidence gave their darkest fears a concrete shape. They agreed to help. They were not lawmen, and what they were planning was not entirely legal. It was a vigilante action, a dangerous and desperate gambit. They would be a small posse, 4 men armed with rifles and resolve, planning to ride into the belly of the beast under the cover of darkness. Their goal was simple and terrifying: to raid the Shepherd homestead, to find proof of their crimes, and to confront the family that had haunted the region's nightmares for decades. They chose a moonless night, the kind of oppressive, ink-black night that was common in the hollow. They rode in silence, the only sounds the soft thud of their horses' hooves on the damp earth and the frantic beating of their own hearts. As they descended the familiar path into the valley, the temperature dropped and the ever-present mist coiled around them like ghostly serpents. The world dissolved into a monochrome of gray and black. They tethered their horses a mile from the inn and proceeded on foot, moving with the practiced stealth of hunters. The forest, which was usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, was eerily silent, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Deputy Miller led the way, his revolver in his hand, his senses straining against the darkness. Finally, through a break in the trees, they saw it: the Shepherd's Rest. It was a dark, hulking shape against the slightly less black sky. A single point of orange light glowed in a downstairs window, a lone lantern casting long, dancing shadows. The sight was deceptively peaceful, almost domestic. It looked like any other frontier home, its inhabitants asleep in their beds. But the men in the woods knew better. They knew that behind that placid facade lay a charnel house, a place of unimaginable horror. They could smell the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke on the air, and it carried a greasy, nauseating undertone that made the blacksmith, Thorn, gag quietly. They spread out, taking their positions as planned, their rifles ready. The silence stretched, thick and taut, and then, on Miller's signal, they moved. The raid began with the explosive crack of a heavy boot against the inn's front door. The wood splintered but held. Isaac Thorn, the blacksmith, put his massive shoulder into it, and with a scream of tortured timber, the door flew open, crashing against the inside wall. Miller and the McLeod brothers poured in after him, lanterns held high, their weapons sweeping the room. The scene that greeted them was not one of a family startled from sleep. The Shepherds were waiting. Silas stood by the hearth, a massive double-bitted wood axe held loosely in his hands. Alara was seated in her rocking chair, her knitting in her lap, a serene, chilling smile on her face. Jebediah and Caleb stood on either side of the staircase, each holding long, heavy knives. They had been expecting them. The moment of stunned silence was broken by Silas, who let out a low, guttural roar and charged. He moved with a speed that was terrifying for a man his size, the great axe whistling through the air. Thorn, the blacksmith, met his charge, parrying the axe blow with the barrel of his rifle. The impact sent a shower of sparks into the dim room and nearly tore the gun from his hands. A brutal, chaotic melee erupted. The McLeod brothers fired their rifles, the deafening explosions filling the small space, but the Shepherd sons moved like wraiths in the flickering lantern light, dodging and weaving with unnatural agility. It was not a fight against innkeepers. It was a battle against something feral, something that had been honing its predatory skills for a lifetime. The air filled with the sounds of struggle, the crack of gunfire, the clang of metal on metal, and the hoarse, desperate breathing of men fighting for their lives. The fight in the common room was a whirlwind of desperate violence. The Shepherds fought not with the panic of cornered criminals, but with the cold, efficient fury of apex predators defending their territory. While Isaac Thorn was locked in a life-or-death struggle with Silas and his great axe, the two sons, Jebediah and Caleb, descended on the McLeod brothers. They didn't make a sound, their faces blank masks of concentration as they lunged with their long knives. One of the brothers, Angus McLeod, managed to bring the butt of his rifle up, catching Caleb in the jaw with a sickening crunch. But the other son, Jebediah, was faster. He slipped under the other brother's guard and his knife flashed out. A pained, wet gasp filled the room, and John McLeod staggered back, clutching his side, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. He fell to his knees, his rifle clattering to the floor. The reality of their situation crashed down on Deputy Miller. This was not a simple arrest. This was a slaughter. These were not just killers, they were practiced fighters, utterly desensitized to violence. He saw the cold look in Jebediah's eyes as he raised his knife again to finish the wounded man. Miller didn't hesitate. He raised his revolver, took aim, and fired. The shot was deafening. Jebediah's head snapped back, and he collapsed in a heap, his knife falling from a nerveless hand. The sudden death of one of their own seemed to momentarily break the spell. The fight paused for a single, stunned heartbeat. The death of Jebediah seemed to drain the feral strength from the rest of the family. Silas, seeing his eldest son fall, let out a howl of pure, animalistic rage and grief. And in that moment of distraction, the blacksmith Thorne slammed the stock of his rifle into the big man's temple. Silas staggered, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed to the floor like a felled oak. With the patriarch and one son down, the final son, Caleb, seemed to shrink. The predatory gleam in his eyes was replaced by a look of dazed shock. Angus MacLeod, his face a mask of fury over his wounded brother, subdued him quickly. Alara Shepherd, however, had not moved from her rocking chair. She watched the entire bloody affair with the same serene, chilling detachment, her smile never wavering, not even when her son was killed before her eyes. The immediate fight was over. The surviving members of the posse were breathing heavily, their bodies bruised and bleeding. John MacLeod was groaning on the floor, the wound in his side grievous. But the true horror they all knew was yet to come. They secured Silas and Caleb with ropes, their hands tied tightly behind their backs, and then they stood in the eerie silence of the room, listening to the slow, steady creak of Alara's rocking chair. The house was unnervingly clean, the floorboards scrubbed, the surfaces polished. But underneath the smell of gunpowder and blood, there was another scent, a smell Miller recognized from his first visit. The thick, savory smell of cooked meat, and something else beneath it, a coppery, metallic tang that now seemed to coat the back of his throat. With the shepherds bound and the wounded John MacLeod tended to as best they could, Deputy Miller began the search. He knew the proof he needed wouldn't be in plain sight. They started in the kitchen. It was as clean as the common room, almost sterile. A large cast-iron stove stood against one wall, and a massive, industrial-looking meat grinder was bolted to a heavy wooden table. It was far larger than any normal family would require. They searched the pantry, finding barrels of flour, sugar, and salt, alongside an array of jars containing pungent, unidentifiable herbs and spices. It was all disturbingly normal. They moved through the rest of the small house, searching the bedrooms upstairs. They found little, only sparse, simple furniture and a few changes of clothes. There were no personal effects, no letters, no books, nothing to suggest the inner lives of the people who lived here. It was the home of ghosts. But as Miller returned to the main room, his eyes were drawn to a feature he hadn't noticed in the chaos of the fight. In the far corner, partially obscured by a stack of firewood, was a door. It was low and squat, set into the floor. A cellar door. But unlike any cellar door he had ever seen, it was not made of simple planks but of thick, heavy oak, reinforced with bands of rusted iron. A large, heavy-duty padlock, the kind used for prison cells, secured a thick hasp. This was not a door designed to keep out the winter cold. It was a door designed to keep people out. Or, a far more chilling thought occurred to Miller, to keep something in. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that the answers he sought lay on the other side. Isaac Thorne, the blacksmith, made short work of the lock. With a heavy hammer and a crowbar from the hearth, he attacked the hasp with controlled, powerful blows. The metal screamed and groaned in protest before finally snapping with a loud crack. The four men stood over the door, a palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. Together, they heaved the heavy oak door open. It swung upwards with a low groan, revealing a set of steep, stone steps leading down into absolute blackness. The smell that rose from the opening was a physical assault. It was a thick, gagging stench of the slaughterhouse, of old blood, of rot and decay, mixed with the sharp chemical odor of lye and preservatives. It was a macabre, forbidden smell that spoke of things that should not be. Thorn, a man accustomed to the heat and grime of his forge, recoiled, his face pale. The MacLeod brothers, who had grown up around the earthy smells of the farm, looked like they were about to be sick. Miller, steeling himself, took a lantern and started down the steps, his revolver held out in front of him. Each step down was a descent into a colder, fouler layer of air. The lantern light cut a weak, trembling circle into the oppressive gloom, revealing damp stone walls slick with some unidentifiable slime. The silence from the room above was gone, replaced by the sound of dripping water and the scuttling of unseen things in the corners. They were descending into the belly of the beast, into the very heart of the shepherd's horrifying secret. At the bottom of the steps, Deputy Miller raised his lantern high, and the full, unspeakable horror of the cellar was revealed. It was not a storage cellar. It was a human abattoir. The sight was a scene from a madman's nightmare, a systematic perversion of all that was sacred. Along the far wall, heavy iron hooks hung from the ceiling beams. From two of them, suspended by their ankles, were the partially butchered bodies of a man and a woman, their skin pale and waxy in the lantern light. In the center of the room stood a massive, blood-stained table, its surface covered in an array of terrifyingly specialized tools. There were not just knives and cleavers, but saws with fine, sharp teeth, wicked-looking hooks, and instruments that looked disturbingly surgical. Vats of brine and salt stood in one corner, and barrels filled with a dark, viscous fluid were lined up against another wall. It was a factory of death, organized with a chilling, workmanlike efficiency. The sheer banality of the setup was what was most shocking. The shepherds had not just killed, they had processed. They had turned human beings into a product. One of the MacLeod brothers let out a choked, agonized cry and stumbled back up the stairs, unable to witness any more. But Miller and Thorne stood frozen, their minds struggling to comprehend the scale of the depravity before them. This was the source of the strange ta. Sting meat. This was the secret ingredient in Alara's famous pies. The whispers and rumors were all true, but the reality was infinitely more disturbing. The horror of the cellar was not in gore, but in its cold, methodical detail. As Miller and Thorne forced themselves to examine the scene, the true nature of the shepherd's enterprise became terrifyingly clear. This was not the work of frenzied, insane killers. This was a craft, honed and perfected over generations. On a smaller table near the vats, they found implements for tanning hides. Stretched on a wooden frame was a large piece of pale leather that, on closer inspection, revealed the faint, ghostly tattoo of an anchor on what would have been a man's forearm. The shepherds were not just consuming their victims, they were using every part. The air was thick with the evidence of their macabre industry. The stone floor was canted toward a central drain, a detail that spoke of routine, of washing away torrents of blood. Piles of carefully cleaned and sorted bones were stacked like firewood in one corner, long bones here, ribs there. It was a larder of human misery. Miller felt a profound sense of psychological vertigo. He was looking at the logical endpoint of a worldview that saw other human beings as mere livestock, as raw material to be harvested. There was no passion here, no rage, just the cold, detached efficiency of a butcher. He thought of Alara Shepherd, sitting upstairs in her rocking chair, her serene smile a mask for the monstrous secret she kept in her basement. He understood now that her family was not just cursed or insane. They were something else entirely, something for which the language of law and justice had no adequate words. The cellar was a testament to a level of depravity that defied all comprehension. What Miller and Thorne found next in that forbidden space, however, went beyond the mechanics of murder and cannibalism. It revealed the sheer, horrifying scope of the shepherd's reign of terror. It was a complete and utter perversion of humanity, a systematic erasure of lives that has been largely banned from the official, more sanitized historical records of the era. The story from this point forward gets much, much worse, delving into the cold-hearted psychology of a family that saw travelers not as people, but as a harvest. For those with the stomach to continue this descent, Let's explore the final, damning evidence they uncovered in the darkest corner of that evil room. Because piled behind the barrels of brine, they found the victims' last connections to the world they had been stolen from, a discovery that would transform the shepherds from simple monsters into the architects of a multi-generational nightmare. The worst was yet to come. In a dark, damp corner of the cellar behind a stack of empty barrels sat a large, sea-worn wooden chest. It was not locked. Miller lifted the heavy lid, and the beam of his lantern fell upon the contents. It was a chest of trophies, a tangled, glittering mound of personal effects, the final remnants of the dozens of souls who had met their end in this house. The light glinted off of pocket watches, their chains intertwined like metallic snakes. It caught the dull gleam of wedding rings, brooches, and silver lockets, so many lockets. There were wallets made of worn leather, some still containing faded letters from loved ones. There were spectacles, hair combs, and a small, beautifully carved wooden bird that must have been a child's toy. And beneath it all, a stack of daguerreotypes and tintype photographs in small metal frames. Miller picked one up. It showed a young, smiling family, a man, a woman, and two small children posing proudly in their Sunday best. He recognized them from a missing persons flyer that had circulated 3 years ago. This chest was the shepherd's ledger, a silent, damning catalog of their crimes. Each object was a life, a story, a network of family and friends left to wonder and grieve forever. This was not the work of people killing for survival. This was sport. It was a collection, a monument to their own monstrosity. The sheer volume of items was staggering, suggesting their work had been going on for decades, perhaps since the moment they first settled in this hungry hollow. This treasure chest of stolen lives was the final, irrefutable proof. When they brought the shepherds before the evidence of their crimes, the bound family members dragged from the house and forced to stand at the entrance to the cellar, their reaction was perhaps the most chilling part of the entire ordeal. They did not weep or confess. They did not rage or deny. They simply stared. Silas, his head bleeding from the blacksmith's blow, looked down into the darkness with a kind of dull, proprietary air, as if inspecting his storeroom. Caleb, the surviving son, looked vacant, his eyes empty of all emotion. And Alara, the matriarch, looked upon the scene of butchery at the trophy chest and the bodies on the hooks, and her thin, serene smile widened slightly. There was no remorse, no shame, no fear of judgment, earthly or otherwise. It was a profound and terrifying silence, the silence of a species so far removed from common humanity that the concepts of good and evil were utterly meaningless. Deputy Miller, his voice shaking with a fury he could barely control, demanded an explanation, a reason. "Why?" he yelled, his voice echoing in the dead air of the hollow. "Why did you do this?" Alara Shepherd turned her head slowly and looked directly at him. Her eyes were like black, bottomless pits. She said nothing. Her silence was the only confession they would ever get. It was an answer more horrifying than any scream or boast, a silent declaration that to them, what lay in the cellar was not a crime. It was simply their nature. Leaving the cellar behind, Miller and Thorne re-entered the kitchen, their eyes now cursed with a horrifying new understanding. The entire room was transformed from a place of rustic hospitality into a theater of the macabre. The oversized meat grinder bolted to the table now seemed monstrous, a machine designed to erase human identity, to turn faces and stories into anonymous, palatable flesh. The large, deep oven, which had once seemed perfect for baking bread, now looked like a crematorium, capable of cooking pies large enough to feed many guests or perhaps to destroy evidence. On a shelf above the stove sat the barrels of Alara's secret spice blend. Miller unstoppered one and took a cautious sniff. It was a pungent, almost overpowering mix of sage, rosemary, garlic, and other, more exotic spices he couldn't name. It was a blend designed not just to add flavor but to mask, to overpower the subtle, gamey sweetness of what they called long pig. The meat pies, the very symbol of the shepherd's false welcome, were now revealed as the final, grotesque act of their predatory cycle. They were not just feeding themselves on their victims. They were feeding the victims to other victims, to passing strangers, perhaps even to lawmen like himself. It was a joke of profound sickness and cruelty, a culinary horror show performed for an unsuspecting audience. The entire inn, every scrubbed floorboard and polished utensil, was part of an elaborate and monstrous stage set for their forbidden feast. The ride back to town was a grim, silent procession. They walked their horses, with John McLeod slung over a saddle, barely clinging to life, and their 3 prisoners bound and walking ahead of them. When they arrived at dawn, the news of what they had found in Whispering Hollow spread through the small community like wildfire. At first, there was disbelief. The story was too monstrous, too outlandish to be true. But as Miller, Thorne, and Angus MacLeod recounted the horrors of the cellar, as they described the trophy chest and the bodies on the hooks, disbelief curdled into a collective, rising wave of rage. The town's fear of the shepherds, a fear that had kept them isolated and safe for so long, evaporated, replaced by a furious primal need for vengeance. A mob formed in the street outside the sheriff's office, where the shepherds were being held in the town's 2 small cells. The crowd grew from a dozen men to 50, then 100, their faces grim in the morning light, their voices a low, angry hum. They were farmers, merchants, and laborers, many of whom now realized that friends or relatives who had vanished years ago had likely ended up in the shepherd's cellar. They shouted for the prisoners. They wanted to bypass the law, to drag the cannibal family from their cells and administer their own brutal, immediate justice. In a strange and bitter twist of irony, Deputy Miller, the man who had risked everything to expose the shepherds, now found himself standing on the steps of the jailhouse, his rifle held across his chest, protecting his monstrous prisoners from the very people he had sought to protect. The trial of the Shepherd family was a sensation that gripped not just Kentucky, but the entire nation. Newspapers from as far away as New York and Boston sent reporters to the small county seat, eager to print every lurid detail of the case. The courtroom was packed every day with a morbidly curious public, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. The prosecution, led by a stunned but determined district attorney, laid out its case with grim precision. Isaac Thorne and Angus MacLeod gave their harrowing testimony of the raid and the fight. Deputy Miller, the hero of the hour, described in cold, factual detail the discovery of the cellar, the tools, the bodies, and the chest of stolen belongings, which were displayed as evidence for the horrified jury to see. Piece by piece, the story of the cannibal family of Whispering Hollow, as the papers dubbed them, was laid bare. Throughout the entire proceeding, the 3 surviving shepherds, Silas, Alara, and Caleb, sat perfectly till at the defense table. Their court-appointed lawyer, a young man who looked perpetually on the verge of fainting, could do little. His clients refused to speak to him, refused to acknowledge the proceedings, refused to offer any defense whatsoever. They simply sat and stared, their expressions blank and unreadable. Alara, in particular, seemed to draw the crowd's horrified gaze. She would occasionally survey the courtroom with her serene, unsettling smile, making eye contact with individual jurors, holding their gaze until they were forced to look away, deeply unnerved. Their silence was their final, most powerful act of defiance, a refusal to participate in a world whose rules they had so monstrously rejected. Jury's deliberation was a formality. It took them less than 15 minutes to return with a verdict, guilty on all counts of murder for every victim they could identify. The judge, his face a grim mask, sentenced all 3 Silas, Alara, and Caleb to death by hanging. The date was set for 1 month later. On the day of the execution, the entire town and hundreds of visitors from surrounding counties gathered in the public square. A massive gallows had been constructed, large enough for all 3. The shepherds were led from the jail, clad in simple black garments. They showed no fear, no emotion. They walked to the gallows with a steady, almost placid gait. Silas and Caleb remained silent to the very end, but as the hangman placed the noose around Alara's neck, she turned her head and scanned the crowd, her black eyes seeming to pierce through every person present. And then, in a voice that was not loud but carried with chilling clarity over the silent crowd, she spoke her first and only words of the entire ordeal. She did not ask for forgiveness or proclaim her innocence. She whispered a curse upon the jury, the judge, the town, and the very land they stood on. She promised that their hunger would not die with them, that the hollow would remember, and that the earth itself would demand repayment for their stolen bloodline. Then the trapdoor sprung, and the Shepherd family dropped into eternity. But her final, venomous words hung in the air long after they were gone, planting a seed of fear that would grow for generations. In the aftermath of the executions, the town tried to purge the memory of the Shepherd family. A mob, armed with torches and barrels of kerosene, rode out to Whispering Hollow one night. They did not stop at the inn. They burned everything. The house, the barn, the Macabre smokehouse, all of it was consumed in a great roaring pyre that lit up the night sky and could be seen for miles around. They wanted to erase the stain, to salt the earth where such evil had taken root. But some things cannot be so easily erased. The story did not end with the fire. The land, as Alara had cursed it, seemed to remember. Whispering Hollow became a shunned, forbidden place. The trail leading to it became overgrown, and no one dared to venture into the valley. Those who did, either by accident or by foolish dare, returned with disturbing stories. They spoke of a persistent, unnatural chill in the air, even on the hottest summer days. They reported hearing faint whispers on the wind that sounded like a tuneless, humming melody. Some swore they could smell a phantom scent that drifted from the blackened, vine-choked ruins of the inn, the ghostly, sickly sweet aroma of cooking meat. The place became a source of local terror, a cursed landmark on the mental map of the county. The fire had destroyed the building, but it had only seemed to solidify the legend, turning the shepherds from flesh and blood monsters into something far more enduring, a haunting. As the years passed, the horrifying truth of the Shepherd family began to recede, replaced by the more palatable veil of folklore. The story became a local ghost tale, something to be told around campfires to frighten children. The sharp, horrifying edges of the truth were worn down by time, the names of the victims forgotten, the sheer scale of the atrocity minimized. The cannibals of Whispering Hollow became boogeymen, their crimes transformed from a documented historical event into a maybe-it-happened legend. This process was aided by a quiet, deliberate effort from the county authorities. The official records of the trial, the transcripts, the evidence logs, the disturbing photographs of the cellar were quietly removed from the public archive. They were placed in a sealed collection, banned from general access. Later rumors would claim the entire file was lost in a courthouse fire, a conveniently destructive blaze that wiped the county's most shameful chapter from the history books. It was a conscious act of forgetting. The community wanted to move on, to attract new settlers, to build a reputation for itself that wasn't forever tied to a family of cannibals. And so, the Shepherd case became a piece of forbidden history, a story you only learned through whispers, a cold case not of the law but of public memory. The truth was deemed too disturbing, too dark for the official narrative of progress and civilization that the burgeoning nation wanted to tell about itself. Deputy Aaron Miller was hailed as a hero. He was offered promotions, praised in the newspapers, and celebrated for his courage and tenacity. But the accolades felt hollow, the celebrations grotesque. He could not share in the town's relief because he could not forget what he had seen. The images from the cellar were burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The smell of the place still lingered in his nostrils. The serene, smiling face of Alara Shepherd haunted his dreams. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, leaving an indelible stain on his soul. Miller found he could no longer perform his duties. The petty crimes of drunkards and thieves seemed trivial, almost absurd, compared to the methodical, industrial evil he had uncovered in the hollow. The world no longer made sense to him. The clear line between good and evil had been replaced by a horrifying gray fog. A few years after the trial, he quietly resigned from his position. He packed a single bag, sold his horse, and bought a train ticket heading west, as far away from the Kentucky hills as he could get. He vanished from the town's history, a man broken by his victory. He had been the one to stop the monster, but in doing so, the monster had, in a way, consumed him too. He would spend the rest of his life as a haunted man, forever looking over his shoulder, forever burdened by the knowledge of what human beings are truly capable of. Decades later, the ruins of the Shepherd's Rest are still there, a collapsed pile of blackened stones and charred timber, slowly being swallowed by the relentless green of the Kentucky wilderness. The story lives on, but it raises more questions than it answers. How did a single family manage to perpetrate such horrors for so long, claiming dozens of victims without being caught? Was it merely their isolation, or was there a deeper, more sinister complicity at play, a community's willful blindness? And what of their origins? Were the shepherds an anomaly, a single, twisted branch on the human family tree? Or were they the last practitioners of a dark, ancient tradition of survival cannibalism, brought over from the starved Old World and nurtured in the deep, lawless pockets of the Appalachian Mountains? The official record is silent. The evidence is gone. All that remains is the chilling legend and the cursed piece of land. Local people will still tell you that the hollow is best avoided, that the land is still hungry, and they will point to the unsettling fact that even in the modern era, with its highways and its constant noise, that stretch of country remains a place where people sometimes just vanish. The trail goes cold, the scent is lost, and another name is added to a long, unspoken list. The shepherds are long dead, but perhaps, as Ilara promised with her dying breath, their terrible, forbidden hunger remains.